In lectures 1 and 2, we asked why sortition matters today and where does sortition come from. And there was a common theme that I think came out in both lectures, which is that for many of us, we didn't know what sortition was. And even for someone like me, a political theorist who studies these questions, didn't know what sortition was until very recently. In this lecture, we're going to ask how it is that sortition, which for 1,000 years was seen as the very foundation, the essence of what it means to live in a democracy, disappeared from our political conversation. And then ask how and whether it might be coming back today. So I'm going to tell you a story. Every story begins at the beginning. And the beginning of the story of sortition, as we've already said, is in ancient Greece. The Greeks chose most of their representatives, the people who govern them on a daily basis, by lottery. And here you see a machine that the Greeks used to pick their citizen governors. It wasn't just, though, in Greece. The Italian republics in the 11th and 12th centuries, who really were the next great democratic flourishing in ancient history, also used sortition to select most of their representatives and governing officials. From all of this history up until the 17th and 18th century, it was taken as a presupposition that if you were going to have a democratic society, you selected your representatives by sortition. Baron von Montesquieu, in his book The Spirit of the Laws in 1751, gave voice to this obvious idea. And he wrote, "Voting by lot is in the nature of democracy. Voting by choice is in the nature of aristocracy." What Montesquieu tells us, as Aristotle had already told us, is that if you want a democracy, you can't have elections, because elections will always bring into government the best people, the elite, and not give voice to everybody. If you really want to be democratic, you have to vote by lottery. An interesting formulation, but that's how Montesquieu put it. 10 years later, in his book The Social Contract, Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes, "Voting is for those positions which require men of special talents, such as military officers. Sortition is when good sense, justice, and integrity are sufficient, as they are in judicial offices." What Rousseau says, and this fits with the Greek experience, remember, in the magistracies, 600 of the 700 are chosen by sortition. For most political governors, for most political actors, you just need good sense and integrity. You don't need special skill. And you only vote by election for those positions where you need special skill, when the people have to be the elite, have to be the trained. And this was the common sense from the Greeks all the way up until Montesquieu and Rousseau are writing in the mid-18th century. And yet, within 20 years after Rousseau wrote The Social Contract, sortition disappears from the entire scene of political thinking. In the US Constitution in 1789, sortition not only is not mentioned, it isn't even part of the debate. Nobody talks about sortition. In the French Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, everyone is given a vote as a human right, but no one talks about sortition. And the speech that people say, "We the people of the United States of America," doesn't mean we the whole people, the people who then are chosen by lottery, but we the people get to vote for an elite, an elected elite that will govern us. And so the very premise of modern representative democracy as it emerges with the United States Constitution is that we don't actually bring the entire we the people into government. The point is to elect an elite. And James Madison, one of the leading founding fathers in the United States, in Federalist Paper 57 writes, "The elective mode of obtaining rulers," so election as opposed to sortition, "is the characteristic policy of Republican government." Small r, Republican. And this is important The founders of the United States chose not to create a democracy. Now, it was democratic insofar as everybody could vote if you were a citizen and if you had certain property qualifications, and for the most part if you were white and male. But the basic structure of the US Constitution was not democratic. It was republican. And the idea of republican, a res publica, a public thing, is that you want the government to be run by the public interest. And the people who understand the public interest are the elite, the educated, those who are the best. And so even though there was a democratic element to American constitutional thinking, the goal was actually to elect the best of us. The underpinning of this, the philosophical underpinning of the retreat from sortition, or the rejection of sortition, and the move towards republican elective democracy, is the idea of consent. This comes from a different tradition, not the tradition of Aristotle and Montesquieu and Rousseau, but a tradition that begins with John Locke, who writes, "No one may be taken from this estate, the estate of nature, and made subject to the political power of another, a ruler, but by his own consent." Now, Locke is talking about making people subjects, not making them self-rulers. But he's saying we can only make people subjects when they consent to it. And it's this power of consent that has replaced the democratic idea of citizenship associated with sortition. It's this idea of consent to the election of leaders, legitimate leaders, that has replaced the idea of sortition. This idea of choosing representative government through consensual elections is, as I said before in the last lecture, in a sense saying we want to outsource government to those who will do it better than us. This accords with also the rise of the bourgeoisie. Who are the bourgeoisie? They're the people who would rather spend time on their families, with their families, on vacations, on hobbies, on their jobs, making money. They don't want to be bothered with getting together and talking about, should we hire a new teacher or should we hire a new policeman? They don't want to talk about that stuff. They want to vote for other people. Let them do it. And so the bourgeoisie says government's not that important. In fact, the best government is the government that governs least. That's the basic liberal idea. And so we let other people do that. We who are powerful and rich, we're not going to get involved. We'll vote, we'll give consent, but we're not going to waste our time on it. And this represents the new liberal idea of freedom. Freedom as freedom from the state, the freedom to develop our potentials in our private sphere. And in our private sphere, we can do what we want. We can be a teacher, or we can be a tradesman, or we can be a banker, as long as we don't interfere with the freedoms of others. That's the fundamental tenet of liberalism. And so we ask the government simply for one thing: security from others, so that we can be free in our private sphere. But freedom now becomes a private engagement, not a public act. And the fundamental thinker of this idea of liberalism is Thomas Hobbes. And if you can look at this picture, you can see that here the Leviathan, the ruler, is pictured with thousands and thousands of little people inside of him. He's a representative of everybody. We give our consent, and his will is now law. That's the liberal idea of government. We consent to a ruler, and whatever the ruler says, and we give up our idea and our engagement as citizens. This idea of liberalism works very well when the economy is going well, because then we say, look, let the government govern. We're happy. We're rich. We're doing well. We're making money. We have families. We're happy. But when there are economic crises, or when there's real dissension about how we should be living our lives, we have democratic crises. One of these happened in the 1920s and 1930s, after World War I, leading up to the rise of fascism and illiberalism in the 20th century. We are living through another one of these democratic crises today with the rise of illiberalism. The question is, how can we revitalize democracy? And as I said in the first lecture, there are different theses about this, but one is we actually need to bring the people back into the process. We need to understand that democracy means engaged citizenship. James Fishkin, who's a professor at Stanford, is one of the first people who really began writing about this. And back in the 1980s, he wrote an article about what he calls deliberative polls. So we all know what polls are. Someone calls us up on the phone and says, who do you want to vote for? And you tell them, and then they publish and say 70% say this and 30% say this. And Fishkin says, well, that's not very helpful. Let's bring a randomly selected group of people together. Let them talk to experts. Let them talk to each other. Let them discuss it, and then ask them these questions. Then we get polls that actually tell us what thoughtful people think about who to vote for or what we should do about the environment. And so Fishkin starts to develop this idea that we need to bring deliberation, the practice of everyone engaged in politics, back into politics. And this leads to the idea of citizen assemblies, citizen juries, sortition. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen the rise of these new sortition bodies. In Iceland in 2009, after the financial crisis, they bring together a few hundred Icelandic citizens and they ask them, what are the fundamental values of Icelandic society? And they develop some ideas that will be the guidelines and guideposts for how the Icelandic representatives should make legislation. In Ireland, confronted with thorny issues like abortion, they bring together a citizen assembly and ask them, what should we do? And in a really fascinating process, in a very Catholic and conservative society, the Irish Citizen Assembly decides we should allow abortion. And the parliament accepts that, and it changes the constitution. In France in 2020, President Macron brings together 150 randomly selected French citizens to talk about how to adopt and to engage climate change. And through a 9-month process, citizens come together regularly, meeting with experts, meeting together, talking, learning to trust each other, checking facts, and they come up with proposals on how to change French response to the climate crisis. Now, in the end, Macron did not let their solutions, their proposals, go to a vote. He violated the promise he made that he would do that. And so some people have said, well, this is a failure. But in other ways, it has energized people. And around the world, we are now seeing movements to engage citizen assemblies, to find ways to bring everyday citizens, randomly chosen, into the democratic process. And that's what's been happening. I've been telling you the story of sortition. It begins in practice in ancient Greece and Italy. It then becomes common sense for Rousseau and Montesquieu and others. If you want a democracy, you choose your rulers through sortition. And then suddenly it is erased, it disappears. And the rise of modern electoral representative democracy completely abandons sortition. And through the theory of consent, we justify selecting leaders by election. And now, amidst the crisis of democracy, we're starting to see a return of interest in sortition. And all over the world, people are experimenting with sortition bodies. Maybe we keep our elective representatives, but we have sortition bodies that say, here are the issues we want you to discuss and decide things on. Or we create another sortition body that says, here are some laws we think you should pass, and you have to vote yes or no. You have to at least listen to us, citizens, and take what we say seriously. In the fall of 2021, the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College will be hosting a conference, Revitalizing Democracy, Sortition, Citizen Power, and Spaces of Freedom. I hope you can join us.